Hello, everybody!
Charles, there's something in my headphones, but I think you're just gonna have to turn it up.
You know what? I think I just might have to.
Because this is my jam.
It's my jam as well. It just doesn't get much better than this, I would think.
How could it get better than this wonderful intro music? And there's the howl.
There's that snuck in right there at the end. The intro was fading. The FTF podcast lay in excitement, and it was an excitement of 3 parts. The most obvious part was a vast, echoing excitement made by the book that was Buddy read, The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss. Hosting the podcast, 2 bearded man-children eased back in their chairs and adjusted their mics. In doing this, they added their eager, open excitement to the larger, echoing one. The third excitement was not an easy thing to notice. It was in you, the listener, waiting for the first pale hint of banter or thought-provoking conversation. This podcast is for you, just as the third excitement is hopefully yours. This was appropriate, as it is, again, hopefully, the greatest excitement of the 3, holding the others inside itself. It was deep and wide as Patrick Rothfuss' beard. It was the patient, cut-flower excitement of a listener who is ready to be entertained.
I'm snapping.
Beautiful.
That's beautiful, Charles. You're such a good poet that Quoth might hate you.
Thank you. That's high praise. Patrick had all those years to write his intros, and I only get a few weeks, so...
Let him behind the curtain. I think you only got maybe 20 minutes before this podcast started.
That's from should I write something? And it would be nice. The good news is I just steal Patrick's writing and then just swap out a few nouns for our own, a few adjectives for our own. And we're here. So welcome, everyone. As said in the intro, this is the Buddy read for The Wise Man's Fear by Patrick Rothfuss, Book 2 of the Kingkiller Chronicles.
Here we are.
We are.
We made it. Charles has caught up with the Kingkiller Chronicle. And
yes, I'm now part of the discussion, or I can be part of the discussion.
And we'll have some of that discussion for you listeners today.
So true.
I'm looking forward to getting into this. I might just read our little sort of synopsis. It's
our
not
bullet points.
Yeah, I mean, this book has a pretty episodic feel to it, I think, anyway. And I pretty much just have Quoth continues telling his story to Chronicler and Bast, covering the following plot points. There's time at the university, then there's a trial that he goes through, traveling to the mayor in Ventus. There's this conspiracy and political intrigue that goes on when he's over in Ventus. Then there's leading a small troop in the goal of finding and ousting bandits. Then pretty quickly we're taken into the Fae, where we're dealing with Felorian and the evils that are the Cathay. And then we get into returning back to the real world, or whatever, and then we head over to watch Quoth get trained in the Lethani by the Adam, and then briefly back to dealing with the mayor and his lovely wife, and then we head back to the school. And then close things out with the Frame story, where we're back in the Waystone Inn. It ends this book anyway ends on something of a temporary positive note. Feels like kind of the I guess in something that is supposed to ultimately be a tragedy, this is kind of the inverse of what we get in like that Star Wars original trilogy.
Right, it's not the Empire Strikes Back where it's
No,
a disaster, a tragedy.
no. We actually get, okay, things are kind of on the up and up, and Quoth says, hey, things are going pretty well, and I want to get started with where things end up going from here, so let's just call it a day, and we'll pick this up tomorrow. And now we eagerly wait for tomorrow to come, Charles.
Yes, we eagerly do. Excellent job with the summary. Very ambitious also to kind of give a quick, comprehensive beat by beat of this massive tome that is Wise Man's Fear, sitting at like well over 1,200 pages and 44 hours of audiobook. It's no small feat to try and take that on, so excellent job.
As people have noted, the the 44-hour audiobook goes a bit longer than one would expect from a day. And then Rothfuss was quick to note that he never said how long a day is in their world.
That's his defense, huh?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't think of it like that. Well, maybe Quoth's just a fast talker, you know?
He must be. He must be cranking that audio book speed up to 1.5. I mean, more than that even.
And Chronicler's writing in shorthand, and
Yeah.
So it's possible. Who knows? It was long though.
It's a weird nitpick. It's one I'm very willing to hand wave away for the sake of an enjoyable book.
Right. Okay, so how do you want to start this bad boy? Where do you even begin?
Well, I think that there's a few topics that are very worth covering that we'll just make sure to bring up. And I think before we get into that, we might as well comment on pretty much all of the little sagas inside of this tome, as you say. So I figure we can just go through those bullet points I listed, and I can pretty much say, hey, Charles, you got anything to say about this part? And maybe I'll have a few things to say too, and we'll see where that gets us before we dive into the big discussion questions that we want to tackle.
All right. Okay. So that brings us to the opening of this book where Quoth is still at school. Pretty much right where we left off, I would say. He's studying, he's at work, he's, struggling for coins, all that stuff. The only parts of this section that I think for me are really noteworthy, the first would be the trial. And Quoth's decision, like, as the storyteller to just kind of skip those parts. That's in this section, right? Where he's like, and then I got in trouble with Ambrose, and then still blah, blah, blah. The trial's over, and I'm okay. And they had a little back and forth with Chronicler about, like, you're going to skip the trial, but you, like, learned a whole new language. You did all these things. Like, yeah, but you know what? It didn't really affect the greater story that much, so there's not really much point in dwelling on it. Let's move on. And I thought that was kind of entertaining. I thought that was kind of appreciative also. It's like, look, we need to get from A to B, but like this stuff happens, but do we really need to dwell on it? This book is already long enough. I don't think we need to read a whole section dedicated to a trial that doesn't ultimately bear any weight to the story. So, and just as a book that's about storytelling, it's kind of fun also to be like, yeah, and then that happened, and we'll just skip to the next part. So it's a fun tool, I thought.
I thought so too. I thought some of it was kind of Quoth flexing on Chronicler that, hey, this is my story that's told in exactly my words, and this is what you're gonna get. If I don't want to cover it, then you better respect that, because this is the only version of the story that I'm willing to give. I like Chronicler wanting more because it's such a legendary part of Quoth's story, and he
Right, the
wants
way the
to hear it
public
from him.
tells his story, that's like a
Yeah.
huge tale, and he just wants to skip over it.
I like that. I think, like you're saying, I think from the purpose of all this stuff that Rothfuss has to get through in this book and then eventually in next book too, it's okay. I'm okay with skipping over some of this stuff that, do we really need a trial? We need to watch Quoth learn a language, and
No.
I'm ready to move through it.
It's also part of the brilliance of this whole series is kind of the meta of the fantasy genre also, where even Patrick as a writer is like, let's just skip over that. I just don't need to go into any more detail than it happened and it was epic and we can move on. And what makes a story about telling stories so interesting is kind of that meta aspect of it, that greater kind of, this book doesn't take itself too seriously where it gets bogged down in all these epic details like maybe a more traditional high fantasy series will be. But at the same time, while not taking itself seriously, Patrick puts so much work into writing this beautiful prose and allegories, and it's a 1,200 page book. It's insane how much work he put into it, and then to just be like, skip that part, not important, let's go. It's like, I like that a lot. It's a very unique, refreshing read. The other thing that I liked about this section, and then I'm good about talking about the school, is I love when after the trial, he's like, now I have to prepare for my auditions for next semester, and everyone is like, dude, you need to leave. And he's like, what are you talking about? He's like, I won the trial. It's like, no one wants you here, man. You have to go. And he's like, I don't understand. Like, I'm ready. And it's like, dude, I've told you 3 times now, you need to leave. If you try and stay, they'll bankrupt you with the tuition that they set for you. And like, you're too hot right now. You're too controversial. You've kind of peaked at this moment. You just need to go. And I thought that was such a great moment. And Quoth not getting it and being like, but I won the trial. It's all good. It's like, yeah, but do you realize that you've pissed everyone off? Because this book is entirely told through Quoth's perspective. As a reader, we might not even realize that everyone else is mad because he doesn't talk about it. It takes the subtle hints of teachers pulling him aside and being like, vacations are nice. And then his friends being like, so you're really going to stay? And it gets hit with him over and over, and it's one of Quoth's biggest flaws as a character in the way the story's told, is his kind of stubborn, I'm always right attitude. He's not really considering these other perspectives. And I just thought that was a really fun, great moment that helped kind of propel the story forwards.
For sure. I enjoyed that too. I always enjoy those aspects of Quoth where he just can't, because he's got so much self-confidence, I guess.
Right.
That he's often very unable to see things about himself that everyone else around him can tell. And I think part of what Rothfuss is getting at there's a conversation he has at one point with, I don't know if he's a Gaelet or whatever, but that person who used to be a student at the university, but now is got this contraband business and all that kind of stuff that Quoth talks to, who's like, yeah, everyone knows everything. This isn't a quote or anything, but the sense of it was yeah, everyone knows what people say about someone except them themselves. And I thought this was an interesting moment for that from Quoth, and I think you've mentioned, he's particularly vulnerable given some of his foibles, if you will. And I also really appreciate during that, you said teachers were pulling him aside, and where Elksay Dahl tells him the ignorant edema story.
Yeah.
I love Rothfuss's stories within the stories. I think that's so stories within the stories within the stories. Let's be
Right.
honest. But I love these little stories that people will tell because Rothfuss has such a talent for getting across these almost fable-like stories that teach a lesson. And the ignorant edema I particularly enjoyed because the point it drives home where it's that the like person trained at the university who knows all this stuff and wants to talk all this philosophy with his edema ends up he can't swim when there's a storm at sea.
Right.
And the edema's like I don't know any of that like stuff that you're talking about with all the philosophy, but we're in a boat and if this boat goes down, then I'm gonna swim to shore. I don't know what's gonna happen to you with all your book learning.
Right. No, that's such a great moment, and Patrick's ability to change voice when he's telling these different stories is so great too. And again, it's Quoth listens to that and he still doesn't get it. He's like, okay, cool story. What are you saying? Like, and he's like, sometimes, vacation's not such a bad thing. And he still doesn't get it. And it's like, dude, go. Be gone with you. Get out of here. It's such a great moment.
It really is. Well, are we feeling good about heading over to Ventus?
Yeah, I mean, that was another great example of him, like, kind of brushing over a part of the story where it's like, yeah, that was a nightmare. Like, the ship, we had a shipwreck and I was living off the streets for a long time. It took me several months being destitute, lost everything. And then I got there. It was fine. I'm here now. And this is where we're, like, picking back up. Another good moment of, like, reminding us that this is a story being told and by a human being, and he's picking and choosing what he wants to say. So I appreciated that. I thought it was nice. And then that brings us to Ventus.
Well, what we're dealing with here is Quoth has to deal with all the political machinations of a totally new city. He's been primed some already coming in, but he's thrown in the thick of these things, and pretty quick he's dealing with that the mayor is being, from Quoth's perspective as an arcanist, when he sees this so-called healer like giving the medicine to the mayor, he realizes that the mayor is being poisoned, and he has to try to figure out how to convey that to the mayor in a way that is basically like, yeah, I know you just met me and this other guy you've trusted with your health for a really, really long time, but he's poisoning you, and
right,
you gotta believe me on that, which is an interesting. I what I really appreciate about that was, I guess, part of what I feel about like having read a lot of fantasy novels and like knowing the tropes and stuff is I was almost a little confused when the mayor didn't believe him right away until I thought about it. I was like, why would he believe him right away? But I feel like in most fantasy stories, it's like I found out that they're poisoning you. They're poisoning you, so you like need to believe me. And the person's like, oh, thank you so much. Like, yeah. No, I know. But it's like Rothfuss is like, no, that's not how it would work. It's like, who would you believe?
Yeah, the person who's been serving you faithfully for years and years and years. And,
yeah.
Or this guy that literally, this is like one of the first times you're meeting him. I also thought it was a nice, little twist and a little intrigue in the story also. I was very interested in this development. It's also kind of starts to show you a little bit about Quoth's development and his personal growth, where we know he's had huge issues with dealing with important people, nobility, teachers, where he's really upset teachers in the past, and that's like he just immediately would try and upstage them or say they were wrong and try and teach the class.
Problems with authority.
Yeah, he would just mouth off to the noble son, the baron's son. So like he's had several of these experiences already, and to see him actually take a moment to pause and make an adjustment is an interesting thing to see. You can tell he's growing a little bit. I mean, he still falls into those same problems. He's still Quoth, but at least, he is able to kind of recognize it a little bit. So I thought that was kind of a really interesting moment in the story to be like, okay, Quoth is starting to come into his own a little bit. He's starting to learn from his mistakes, which is a hard thing for him to do. So it was a really interesting delve into like this whole conspiracy. It's like there's this added element of like, oh, I can't upset the nobility. He's the only, like, he could throw me out of here in 2 seconds. So I really gotta rely on like logic and reasoning with this guy to convince him otherwise. And for all intents and purposes, the mayor was very patient with him, like maybe more patient than like he deserved at times, especially when like the birds weren't dying and things like that. And it was a close one there.
Oh yeah, that was touch and go, and it's funny because Quoth is a little rash at times, as we've talked about. To see times where he just like says something, and I wouldn't even be that alarmed because it's just like so like Quoth to have said whatever outlandish thing he'll come out with. But I'm also reminded that, oh wait, he's talking to a guy who's one of the most powerful people in this world, and even Quoth has those moments internally too where he's like, oh wait, I probably shouldn't have said that in that way.
Yeah, he comes to regret it. He's like, maybe this was coming in a little too hot. Like, how much evidence did I really have that this is what was happening? So that was a fun part where it's like, I can't even trust. I don't even know if I was right about this whole thing. So it's kind of another element to this short little mystery story that was thrown in at the first quarter of this book.
For sure. I think we deal with that. We also deal with him helping the mayor court Melwin Lackless. I know there's a lot there. All these, I might as well start talking about this now. All the Reddit theorists out there and whatnot, who I believe I'm on the same page with them, think that Melwin Lackless is probably Quoth's aunt. So she hates the Edema Rue because her sister ran off with a Rue. There's, I think back in Name of the Wind, there's maybe it was early in this book though, I can't remember. There's a poem, or not a poem, it would never be a poem, song that Quoth's father wrote about his wife that she got so mad at that she made him oh god, I can't remember. It's like sleep under the
I don't remember
caravan or whatever it was like, but anyway, the song is Dark Lorien, Arladin's wife, has a face like the blade of a knife, has a voice like a prickle-brown burr, but can tally a sum like a moneylender. My sweet Tally cannot cook, but she keeps a tidy ledger book. For all her faults, I do confess, it's worth my life to make my wife not tally a lot less. And some people have noted that Melwin's older sister who ran off with an Edema Rue is was named Natalia Lackless. So this bit about not tally a lot less, and some of the other things I mentioned, like the fact that Melwin is noted by Quoth to like be eerily familiar looking, but we're not exactly sure why when he's thinking through it. And I mean, that song is pretty telling, and the fact that she got so upset about it, and he literally calls her my sweet Tally in the song,
right?
It's cleverly written, so we don't really think much of it but when it's first dropped, but it's
No, I actually hadn't considered that, but it makes sense. I'm subscribed to that theory for sure.
yeah, it feels to me like the level of the John's parentage theories that were going around before the show confirmed what most people thought, where it's
Right.
like almost reached a point where there's too much in there to like
Right.
not say, oh yeah, well that one we pretty much can take for granted that that one's true,
Right.
and we can
Right.
work from there.
Exactly. And another interesting, for me, kind of foreshadowing moment that happens during all of this is, of course, who do we run into almost too conveniently, but our old pal Denna.
Denna.
Denna pops in. He just bumps into her. This massive city that has like multiple levels and tons of people. He bumps right into her, literally. And I always thought that was kind of suspicious. And they're talking, and she's like, "Oh yeah, my patron is here." And all of a sudden, the patron pops back up for the first time in this book, I believe. He had been like missing. He'd been or she had been MIA until now when they're in Ventus. And then she keeps mentioning, she's like, "Oh, he has me researching like genealogy and like the histories of families," which we know Quoth was talking to Codicus about, the poisoner. He was like,
Yep.
that was Quoth's cover story for going in and talking to him to get information about Lackless, to help the mayor court to court Lady Lackless there. So I was like, that's way too much of a coincidence. And then I pulled a quote. This is from Dennis, where they're talking about the patron. She says, "Who knows? Running in the circles you do, you may have already met my patron and not even known it." And Denna always likes to speak in really cryptic stuff and in like poetic terms and things like that. Everything has multiple meanings with her, or she has a very knowing way of saying things. And this is just in line with like, maybe she knows something, maybe not. She's always playing at something. And all these things put together, plus the description of her red lips. It's like all of those moments coming together. I'm like, this is way too coincidental and way too cryptic for me to not suspect something. And I'm not sure what it is. I'm not smart enough to deduce anything at this point, but I'm like, something's going on here. Like Patrick is dropping clues left and right in these moments in Ventus that
For sure. I can speak to that a little bit,
Sure.
at least what kind of theories people throw out in the communities and whatnot. So a lot of people think that that her patron is Braden, the guy that both plays Tack with. And yeah, so he is very cryptic too about what his actual role in everything is, and he disappears around the same time that Denna says her patron is gone, and he is also gone, I believe, when Quoth runs into one of the Chandrian out in the bandit stuff.
Right.
So some people even think that Braden is, I believe, Heliax, if I'm not messing that one up. But so that's a big theory. The extent to which Denna does or doesn't know things, I'm very like, it's hard to tell.
Right.
There's some reason to believe that, like, so Denna also doesn't talk about her past. Some people think that like Denna is almost the like Quoth equivalent on the side of like, she thinks the Amir are like the bad guys, while Quoth thinks the Chandrian are the bad guys. Maybe the Amir killed Denna's parent. This is all speculation, right?
Right.
But whatever Denna's tragic past is, maybe the Amir did to her what the Chandrian did to Quoth. So it's kind of like Denna in a lot of ways is Quoth's mirror image, and maybe she's chasing revenge on the Amir and thinking the Chandrian are the like her key to that, while Quoth is doing the opposite. So there's some things to believe around that. There's also that the The whole Natalia Lockless bit, there's even people who speculate, I don't think this is true, there's people who speculate that Denna is Natalia Lockless, and they'll draw, which, take note that Natalia is Meluin's older sister, but there's also mention from, oh god, maybe it's Diak, who says in Name of the Wind that Denna hasn't seemed to age in the entire time that he's known her.
Yeah.
So, like, some weird stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly it is, I think, though I've probably, haven't read these books already and scoured the internet to learn some stuff. I've got some hints here, but it's hard to put it all together.
Yes, Denna's mysterious past is definitely some sort of clue into like who is she really? Like, she's constantly changing her name is another thing, so no one knows like her real name. So there's this whole mystery built around her. We also know that they have a falling out, and she's not present at the Waystone Inn, so that is also a clue. And her patron, who I firmly believe Quoth has already met at this point by the end of this book.
Yes, I think that's fair to say.
I think that quote, like, who knows, maybe you might have already met my patron and not even known it, is too on the nose to not be true. So I honestly think that we've encountered her patron. So then the idea is, like, is Denna a tool being used by someone, or is she the one pulling the strings? Like, that's another thing I'm not sure on. Like, Denna mysteriously appears before Quoth is even a story people are telling. Like, it's not until he actually gets to the university and gets given 3 talents that he starts to earn some notoriety for himself. So the fact that he runs into Denna before any of that, and then she pops up afterwards, is also something kind of unusual. You wonder what exactly is going on here, and there's not enough clues for me to deduce it myself, but I'm sure it's all in here. So it's one of the more interesting things that keeps me guessing, like, what is going on with Denna? Like, it's too convenient at times, too suspicious at times, too knowing at times for me not to be like, something very a larger like conspiracies going on that's plotting something, and what it is I can't say.
It's hard to say, and I think it has the feel of something that when book 3 comes out will seem inevitable in retrospect, but because it's so clear that something's going on there, and we also know that Denna plays a critical part in how things end up where they end up, not just because of the fact that she's one of the main characters in this story, but also because one thing Chronicler says when he first arrives is, hey, I heard there was a girl or a woman, I don't know what he says, and Quoth is like, what do you know of her? Like, like, how could you know anything of her kind of way. So that remains to be seen, and I think there's so much more we could talk about here, but I want to keep us rolling.
Yes.
Past the stuff with the mayor.
It's just a testament to Patrick's writing, where he can keep the mystery alive, and even after it's gone under as much scrutiny as it has, there's still nothing that concrete, and we're all eagerly awaiting. So I just think it's what makes this one of the masterworks of modern fantasy, is when you can face as much scrutiny as thousands of fantasy fans on the internet and still come out, with a solid mystery. That's an achievement in its own.
Well said, Charles.
Thank you.
Let's take a trip into the woods, and we've got Quoth in charge of a small troop here. We got a little new cast of characters. And
something a little more traditional in fantasy, also, like a troop on the trails. It's
kind of a quest type feel to it.
Yeah, the mayor just was like, "Dude, I can only take so much of you right now. You have to go." It's like what everyone seems to do with poor Quoth is just like, "Dude, you were interesting at first, but it's like I gotta live my life now." So He's almost like
he can be
and it's
too
funny
much
how
trouble.
Quoth doesn't like
More trouble
really
than he's worth.
piece it together until he's already like on the trails, and he's like, wait a second. He's getting rid of me this whole time. He didn't think I was like the only man for the job. It's like I either die or I succeed, and either way he's happy. So
yep. There's a beautiful quote that Stanchion says early on describing Quoth, which is, young six-string here is so sharp he can hardly help but cut himself.
Yeah.
I was like,
that's good.
That's Quoth. And
So
too
true.
clever by half, I think he's described as at other points.
Right.
I think I love those aspects of Quoth. Some people, I guess, we had our Mary Sue conversation in our last episode, or not our last episode, the Name of the Wind episode from 2 weeks ago.
Right.
And we have our own thoughts on that, and you can tune into that episode to find out. But I love these aspects of Quoth.
Yes, it definitely some of the bigger flaws of his character for sure. Is himself. A perfect flaw to have for someone that's considerably infallible,
Well, then, I mean, there's a fun little dynamic to this troop. I feel like I think I like seeing new characters, and you're reminded how great, like you like to say, Charles, how great Rothfuss is with just developing voices for characters.
Yes.
Because, I mean, like Daydan and all of them have such clear, distinct voices.
Yes.
I really appreciate that.
No, I was pretty interested in it seemed kind of like a B plot, but I was like, we're getting a little adventure. Quoth is actively doing something. It's an interesting little side story, and I always loved. Another thing that I love about Rothfuss's writing is his use of perspective. So we see a lot of these characters, like, when Patrick creates all these characters, he obviously knows everything about them, but then he presents them through the point of view of Quoth, and it's really interesting. Like when we first meet Tempe or Tempe, how are we going to say his name? Tempe. Tempe. It's like where all these things seem like antisocial and unusual, and then more light gets shed on it, and then we actually get to the Adem, and so I very much appreciate how everything's told through Quoth's perspective when we go through this discovery, and all these, he's like, he didn't even realize like they were in love, and like the other two characters were in love, and then he's like, why doesn't someone just tell them? And it's like, hello. Like, how many people have tried to tell you about dinner? So it's just like a really interesting dynamic that happens in this section of the story, and it's always fun to be reminded of this is all through Quoth's perspective. There's still a lot we don't know about these characters, that a lot we still have to understand.
I loved seeing Tempe portrayed. This was my first reread of it, so this is the first time I got to see how Tempe is portrayed when I already know why he's so fidgety, as right. Quoth is describing, or why he won't make eye contact and all this stuff. And I think it really helped me appreciate how masterful Rothfuss is at doing exactly what you're describing, Charles. Rolling out the facets of a character.
Of a whole race of people,
about.
Too. A whole culture. Yeah. Rothfuss was very restrained in all of that.
For sure. He does it... And I mentioned our last episode, or I keep saying that. I mentioned our Name of the Wind episode, that... Rothfuss has the gift of patience in his writing.
Yes.
And that is how we end up with an 1,100 plus page book.
Right.
But it's also how we get to see him just masterfully unveil the Adem and their
and culture. See us like change our perspectives of people as we come to know them. Like I always loved how he gets to the Adem and be like, Tempe, like you were taught from Tempe, that guy sucks.
I love that too. It's like, well, he's not particularly bright.
Yeah.
It's like
So he failed the test like 5 times or whatever it was. It was like it's funny to see the one that was like his teacher is considered for the most part like an unimpressive individual at the school. So those
I
kind
did
of
like
things
that.
where it's like, oh, okay, we find like Tempe's just a dude, which kind of is like Quoth, where it's like you're portrayed as this great person. It's like, oh, he's this guy at an inn waiting to die. It's like there's a difference between what we perceive and then what this person goes on to be like in their actual lives. So I just thought that was all really fantastic, and all that was built in this Troop Bandits section.
It's good stuff.
Yeah.
Then pretty quick after they take down the bandits, and later I guess we find out that from the Cathay that that the bandit leader was one of the Chandrian.
Right. It was kind of telling when like
but-
they barely reacted to an arrow going through his leg and stuff like that. Like
Yeah.
the way he was written, he was just a more stoic, like knowing type of character. So it was it was an interesting little bit of spice to that plot line.
And then we end up with Quoth chasing Felurian into the Fae. And
Oh,
this
boy.
is, I mean, this is something that gets brought up constantly about this book. It's, it's a relatively small portion of the book compared to how frequently it's talked about. I think that's fair to say. And yeah, I mean, I've got some thoughts about the time with Felurian. I'm wondering what your reaction to this time was in your first read, Charles.
Right. Okay. Well, on my first read, it seemed like all of a sudden like they turned a corner and there was the Fae, and I was like, wait, what is happening? So it turned on a dime, but I'm fine with that. He runs in, and then it turns into this like romp. Like I could see how people would be kind of turned off by it, and like, what is this? It's kind of gratuitous. A lot of people throw on the word wish fulfillment, like, and yeah, like the whole point of it is he goes into this fairy world and just has relations with a fairy for gosh only knows how long. It seems like it's removed from time. He just spent all this time like having sex with this fairy creature, and it was very elaborate and long, and all the focus was kind of on that. But for me, this is the reason it was kind of played out was because I think it's a really interesting, again, part of this telling of what's happening on the larger picture, because this is the first time, besides maybe our encounters with the Chandrian, that the stories are coming to life in the narrative, where it's like, yeah, we've encountered the Chandrian twice at this point, but besides that, we haven't really overlapped these kind of fantasy elements of these old tales to what's real. And now we have the Flori and the Fae, and I think a huge telling moment in this thing is how the Fae kind of reacts. Like a whole section of this book and the Kingkiller Chronicles is wrapped around the telling of Tarberlin the Great, and the Fae has no idea who that is. And for me, that like there's a moment specifically where she's like, I don't know anything about that guy, but I do know these other things. So for me, like there were clues being dropped in about what part of those epic tales are the fabrications and what part are the facts. So in that sense, I was very interested in it. And then of course with the demon tree he runs into is really
Cathay.
The Cathay is such a great moment, and he gets the shadow cloak, which is also a great moment. And then I mean, he is at this point still like a teenager, I think, or late teens, early 20s. So
we don't know. It's interesting because of the time stuff of
right, they do mention that.
We
It's like,
don't know
how
how
old
long
is
he
he
was there.
now? It's
We
like,
don't know how old he is now, but when he goes in, he's not yet 17, I think, still. So he's presumably at least 17 by the end of this whole thing.
right.
But
And I mean, that's an age where sexuality is a pretty dominant part of your inner monologue, I would suppose. So it's like, it's in line with his age and where he is in terms of maturity wise. Like, he had no experience with women at all, and he it goes from 0 to 100 like really fast, and that's
sure.
an interesting part of Quoth's character development as well. So I can see why people were upset with how much description went into it. It didn't bother me at all. I was like, this is a fantastical part of the story, and it's there for several reasons. And I think sexuality is just a part of this. It's basically, we forget he's a teenager, so he's coming of age and he's learning all these things. So I was okay with it, and there's a lot about it I really liked too, outside of that stuff.
I'm okay with it too. I mean, I'll say there were times where it was it dragged on a little too long for me. It was a little much, just some of the things that, seeing Rothfuss's incredible descriptive talents applied to some of the things that were going down with Felurian were a little much for me, I'll say. I don't love this part. I'm not going to come in hot with some of the takes that you'll hear from other people about it. I think it serves a purpose. It's just not my favorite part, and I think...
Why do we always have to be on the same page? A little controversy would be nice every once in a while, but no, I totally agree.
Yeah, well, just tell... If you criticize Denna, then maybe I'll freak out. So
I'll keep that in mind later on in the discussion.
Well, all right. The Cathay is a super important part of the story, I believe. I want to touch on that.
I love this part.
It's I think it's really interesting. And I'll say there's a line to describe what the Cathay does, which is that it basically can see every future, so it can just act in a way where it tells you the thing that would most mess up the world. And that's basically what it most wants, is to most mess up the world. So I think Bast describes it as anyone influenced by the Cathay is like a plague ship sailing for a harbor. So right. It's just sending a torpedo on the world, and that torpedo is Quoth. And it's definitely fantastical. And it's interesting to kind of really put the nail in the coffin, I think, of this idea of like, look, you're trying to say that this is a tragedy by doing the frame story and all this kind of stuff, so that's something, and maybe people are holding out some hope, like, maybe Quoth will turn it around and all this kind of stuff. And this is Rothfuss, I think, just trying to say, okay, is it enough for you if I say that there's literally a magical being in a tree that is doomed Quoth to the worst possible and the world, really, in a lot of ways, to the worst possible fate it could conjure up? Is that enough to tell you this here is a tragedy? And there's a beautiful, beautiful line that Quoth, or it's kind of a conversation that Quoth has where he says, it's Quoth looked at Bast for a long moment. "Oh, Bast," he said softly to his student. His smile was gentle and sad. "I know what sort of story I'm telling. This is no comedy. This is the end of the story, Bast. We all know that." Quoth's voice was a matter of fact, as casual as if he were describing yesterday's weather. "I've led an interesting life, and this reminiscence has a certain sweetness to it. But," Quoth drew a deep breath and let it out gently, "but this is not a dashing romance. This is no fable where folk come back from the dead. It's not a rousing epic meant to stir the blood. No, we all know what kind of story this is."
Yeah, it's such a great moment. That moment where they have to do the interlude because Bast is so overwhelmed with the idea that he spoke to the tree. It's like, that's one of my favorites in the whole book, because now you perceive Quoth as tainted now. I mean, he goes on and to do a lot of happy stuff, but this tree has irreversibly kind of tainted his actions, all of his actions. And really all he said was like, yes, Denna's patron beats her, and no, she's not in Ventus anymore. That's really all the tree said, right? The tree didn't say much else.
I think it's mostly that. I can't remember, but the idea is that right? The tree knew exactly the things to say,
And it
whatever
comes
they
back
were,
to
that would
Denna.
most. It's of course.
So this whole the plot thickens at this point of like, why is it all come down on Denna that it's like it's framed on into the Quoth just really likes Denna, and so that's why it's so devastating to hear these things. But it's knowing Rothfuss, there's a whole nother level to it that
for sure
we're not privy to yet. So it'll be really interesting to see all those kind of click into place and go back and reread all these clues like we did with Sanderson and Mistborn. It's like, oh, you were working on these clues for a very long time. So love that moment. And this is gonna be a very telling moment with how all the kind of reveals will be laid out.
I think you're right on point with that one, Charles.
Beautiful.
Then if we're good on flooring the Fae and the Cathay, then we can come back to the real world and head over to train with the 8M, because that's a while that takes place, I think, where he follows Tempe back and
it is quite a while.
And learns of the Lethani, of course.
Yes.
Any thing you want to mention about that time there?
For the most part, I was I liked it all, obviously. But there was a lot about the Adem and the Lethani that, I actually wasn't super on board with. Like, the Lethani itself, I think, is kind of just like whatever. It's like, oh, it's this and it isn't this. It's the way the river flows and the path of. I'm like, whatever, dude. It's fine. So all of that, and that like holier than thou stuff of like, oh, we figured it out, but we're also like super weird in a lot of ways, and like we'll banish people and kill people and whatever. So I'm like, you're not perfect. But the part that I really enjoyed was Quoth's trial, his first trial with the tree, with the sword. Is it the sword tree or the...
Yep.
Yeah.
That was pretty epic.
I love that. Where like, it's just that classic like high fantasy thing of like, he's doing the trial and he comes up with the clever way to have the perfect story tale ending to his trial, where he just lets he calls the name of the wind and is able to do everything perfectly, and he gets to the tree and then he just decides to go back with nothing and let himself get cut by the tree on his hand.
Yep.
Of all places,
to bleed for them.
His bleeding, and also he's had this fear of his hands getting damaged his whole life. And that even like they notice when he's fighting, it's like, why are you like pulling back? And he's like, it's my fingers, and then it's like, your reserve is problematic for us. And then he's like, well, if I'm gonna get cut, let's get cut on my hand. As the placement, not only the fact that he let himself get cut, but the fact that it was on his hand was a beautifully poetic moment. And I love those moments. So that was one of the best moments in the whole book. But I did feel like, I wasn't all on board with the Lethani and the Adem and the way their society's structured and them as characters and a culture. I was like, yeah.
There's some stuff I was also not completely by. I have a hard time with this idea that they wouldn't have a few of their attitudes around sex and around
it's so bizarre.
The idea that there's like no such thing as fathers. I kind of wasn't buying.
Yeah, their whole philosophy of science is like, well, we're so busy doing this other stuff that who cares about science? It's like, what? The minute guns get invented, your society's in trouble.
The idea of a society that everyone's having sex all the time, but has no diseases getting passed around, like explicitly that was worked in.
Yeah.
That there's like no STDs in the entire population, but they all have sex all the time. I don't know. It's a little idyllic for me, all this, that I was like,
it was an interesting idea where it's like we've overcome our weird emotional entanglements with sex so that we can all just kind of be cool. But
I do like that.
Which it was an interesting, thought-provoking idea. But the rest of it, where it's like, where do babies come from, and like STDs don't exist, it's like, what? Okay. And I felt like all the discussions around the Lithani weren't very helpful, and there was a lot of them. I mean, I get the whole idea of like you're supposed to kind of let your mind go and just kind of go with the flow, and the actual specifics of it aren't what's important because the name is always changing and all that stuff. So like I kind of get it, but it didn't make for a particularly interesting section of stuff that was happening. I was like, can we just get past this already? I did like some of the characters. I liked the wise older lady with the funny hat. You know, I was into that, and I liked the little kid, and you know,
to the hat. Oh, I'll say. So I want to follow your lead there, Charles.
Yeah, please.
And say we ought to move on quick, but I also want to say, as you mentioned, the girl is that for all those quote is a Mary Sue truthers out there. I dare you to find me another Mary Sue that gets their ass kicked by a 10-year-old girl over and over again.
Exactly. And, you know, let's move on. But with this one thing, another section of this book that I really loved was he's telling the story, and then Bast leaves the inn, and those Kingsguard guys come in and just beat the crap out of him. Like, absolutely destroy Quoth. So it's like here he is telling the story about how he this actually takes place way later, but when he goes back to the mayor of where he just he kills 7 people, and he's mastered this foreign thing in a very short amount of time, and his hand fighting is so perfect, and he can call the name of the wind. He's got a shade cloak, and yet 2 random guys just come up and bully him and steal his money and kick his face in with no problems. And Quoth just kind of accepts the defeat. He's such a broken guy at this point. He's just yeah, that was embarrassing or whatever, and kept going. And you're like, so for all those people who's saying he's a Mary Sue, think about this now, because you have a guy who's telling these stories about how great he is, and then the first chance we actually get in the real world to kind of test his. Because you're here's where Quoth is guys, you don't want to do this, and then by barely moving his hand, he incapacitates them because he had the training from the Adem. But no, he goes to attack them, and then they just kick him in the face, and he goes down. It's what happened? You don't just forget all this crazy stuff. Maybe he never had it in the first place. So now that was a moment that I love. That back at the Waystone Inn, after he gets all this fighting training, it just gets brutalized, beat down.
You do a great job of showing how it contrasts with what we would expect, as Rothfuss often does, with playing with some of these tropes and knowing that Quoth in his story is so great at everything than just this time, right, where Quoth is going to become Quoth again, and like you said, with just a flick of his hand, beat all these people up. But instead, he's the one that gets beat up, and it'll be interesting to see down the line how much of this is more driving home the point of the unreliable narrator, and how much of this is that Quoth literally is not capable of a lot of the things that he was capable of before.
Exactly. I mean, we've read so many negative reviews of this book that have these kind of complaints of oh, of course he's the best, and he goes on, and it's well, there's a lot that goes unsaid in this series, which I really love. I know there's a lot of fantasy books that can't help themselves, but explain everything. Rothfuss is very, very reserved in what he's writing. He relies on you as the reader to kind of get the subtext. A lot of that is I see a lot of that when I'm reading Denna and all the the hidden meanings behind her, and then also all these Waystone Inn interludes are a huge part of that. And for all those people that have complaints about Quoth is all powerful and stuff, it's you have to read between the lines that we're not at the point where we reveal what's really happening here. So I'm not sure if we're reading that story, if that story is real or not, and if that doesn't sound interesting to you, then this book is not for you. But I mean, it's hard to give him criticism for that when that's like the whole point of the story is seeing everything through Quoth's perspective until we reveal like what actually is happening. So, and that's just a great scene to kind of remind people of, like, you think someone that like went through all these trials at this school and learned how to fight with his hands would be able to get beat up by 2 random Kingsguard soldiers. And he even got the first punch in, he like got a sucker punch in and still lost. It's like, okay, well, what's happening? This is a very telling scene for us.
He does say, I think, that he forgot who he was for a moment or something like that. And I believe he tries to use sympathy and it doesn't work. So there's a few things there where we're like, okay, there's reasons he can't
one of the things I suspected was that he purposely like threw the match so that he doesn't reveal himself as someone that could take on 2 Kingsguard, where it's like, wait, so you beat both of them up and you're fine? Like, it may have been a moment to protect his identity, but
I don't think so, though.
I doubt.
I think it's a combination of what we've been talking about, the unreliable.
Because he does say, "I forgot myself for a second there," which could mean like, oh, I can't like reveal who I can't draw too much attention to myself by beating these guys up. But I honestly don't think he could.
I think the same thing, and it's pretty clear he can't use sympathy anymore at the very least. And I don't know, I think we'll find out a lot more in book 3 with this whole thing. It's very interesting.
Right.
All right, well, then if we're good on the ADEM, then we're going back like Quoth did to Ventus to see the mayor just briefly, just enough time to horribly insult his wife and maybe Quoth's aunt.
Yes. There was this whole moment where he fights the fake musician crew, and he returns the daughters to the village, and they tell this whole story about him, and he feels guilty about it at first, and then it's like, you know what, they were horrible people, I actually don't feel bad. I do really like that plot line, and this also happened right before Quoth got his face kicked in at the Waystone Inn too, I think. Like, he killed all those people, and then they had the interlude, maybe? I can't remember
where that was.
I feel like it was after.
I'll believe you.
But I feel like that all happened. So that was a fun interlude there. And it kind of builds, it was build up from the last book, I think, where they tell the story at the campfire of how how troops work, and you ask for wine like 3 times and you refuse it, or whatever that whole song and dance is. So that was just a fun moment. We can keep going for the sake of time since we're already like circling the drain. There's so much more to talk about, but I just didn't want to leave that behind. That's a fun moment.
For sure. Well, I think we get him back to the mayor. He insults his aunt, probably.
Right.
And then he is whisked away. It has a little bit of a feel, I think, of, all right, we're kind of done here. We need to get him out of here. So Rothfuss doesn't waste time over there. And
also back to his biggest flaw of upsetting people more influential than him.
It's not new ground for Quoth. I think it's totally justified that when pressed, he tries to keep his composure a little bit, but when pressed, he says something he regrets. I don't know if he regrets that one, but he says something that is pretty brazen. We've seen this. I mean, he did to Denna earlier.
Did it to Ambrose.
He's done it to just about every person he can.
Yes.
So he's out of there. I don't know if there's anything you really want to touch on.
There's the box with no lid or hinge or anything, which was the introduction to that. In the timeline, this is the first time Quoth is interacting with this box. It's mentioned twice before. It's mentioned at the very beginning of the book, actually. When I went back to write this new intro, it mentions like the third silence when it's talking about Quoth. He's like staring at the box, and that's also how the book ends. And then there's a section where he pulls Bast aside. He's like, how would you open this box? And Bast tries and can't. And But this is their first time in, like, chronologically that Quoth encounters. I'm assuming it's the same box, but it's not mentioned explicitly.
Probably.
It's probably the same box. It's the same kind of box anyway. Of it's like, oh, there's something inside here. What is it? And so that's worth bringing up as well.
So that's the Lackless box, and if
Mhm.
Quoth is if Quoth's mother is Natalia Lockless, then Quoth is himself at least half Lockless.
Mhm.
So that's, I think, some of the connection here, that he has some sort of familial right to that box. And
Yep.
some people think that what's in the box is actually Quoth's name.
Oh,
So we have
yes.
Elodin, who has, he freaks out when Quoth asks him that question about, what what happens, or what would you think of someone who keeps changing their name? And he thinks, like
Denna.
did Fella do this? Like, oh no. And they was like, oh, calling names, like just the things we call each other. Oh yeah, no, that's probably someone who's like insecure or something.
Right, exactly.
So then so some people think that part of why Quoth is coat and a shell of a man at this point is that he's actually not like Quoth, or what his actual name was, anymore. He's deposited that in this box.
Right. And then another thing I'd want to bring up about all of this is he gets like a wooden ring from Lockless that basically is like, I hate you, and he keeps it. And I always, like, I texted you earlier too, I'm like, these rings are perfect for, the arcanists to kind of use, because it's a piece of metal with symbols on it, which is exactly what they use for what's it called when they make stuff with the symbols?
Sigildry?
Yeah, sigildry. It's like prime for that. And we know that the suspected poisoner Codicus was a trained arcanist. So for me, I'm like, there's something about these rings that I think is going to come back. And I wouldn't be surprised if any of those rings that he had kept or held onto were in some way linked to the people trying to track him or whatever. That's just kind of a conspiracy theory by me.
It's an interesting observation.
Because I'm like, how can they not be? I mean, he's describing it like a piece of metal with something written on it, which is what all these, pieces of synergy are. So, and it can only be a little bit, and maybe it's only doing something really small, like listening to what he's saying or tugging him, or who knows. Like, it's hard to say. I don't know how it all works, but it made me suspicious. So
there's also the Yilish knots.
Yes.
Like Denna's
her braid
that she's in, her braid. Yes. So there's some stuff going on. Hard to say exactly.
There's some stuff going on. Who knows how important it ends up being? And then he also meets with Brayden again, and he gives Brayden all that information. Like, he confides in Brayden.
Back.
Yeah, Brayden is back. Gets all the information. Knows everything Quoth knows about the rings and all that other stuff. So all that stuff. Again, I'm not smart enough to like deduce anything, but I am very suspicious of all of it, which I think anyone reading it would be. But that's the only stuff I wanted to say about when he's back with the mayor. And then
thanks for bringing that up, Charles.
Yeah.
We make it back to the university, and basically we run into Denna again.
Yeah.
During all that, we have that scene where she is having trouble breathing. This is something that has been built a lot with Denna, like that she had pneumonia as a child, and she has these moments. Quoth tells her 7 words. I didn't write them down, but I think it's, I need you to breathe for me. That's 7. So
something
I think I
like
got it.
That. Yeah.
And she notes that it's 7 words, and
he like whispers in her ear. It's very symbolic of calling someone by their name, but so it's a very interesting moment. And a very convenient return for Denna again. So it's like, how many times does she have to conveniently pop up for us to start getting a little suspicious?
I think we're plenty suspicious, Charles. We just don't know what it is. And
dang you, Patrick.
Then we get kind of this date that they go on, and Quoth and Denna at one point, and they kind of flirt, and Quoth says like something a little weakly, tells her like to love him or something. Like she's like asks what she's supposed to do, and he's like trying to be kind of clever, but then he says it weakly, and then she, at least he perceives her as being kind of offended by this, and he gives her back her ring, and then she, I think, takes his hand but doesn't hold it or something like that is how it's described.
Right.
And that's how Quoth perceives anyway. And I don't know, that I literally had to, you remember when I told you you finished the book and I was like, I've got 3 chapters left?
Yeah.
I believe that was right after I read that chapter, and I was like, legitimately, I was like heartbroken. These moments kill me.
It was very much a will they, won't they moment, or it's like finally they're like starting to, they're down to their skivvies or whatever, and they're in the pool and everything's wet, and it's like, is this the moment?
It hurts, Charles.
But Quoth can't help himself.
I mean, but also, like, neither can, like, Denna is also, like, it's hard to say how much is just what Quoth perceives and how much is Denna, but it's like, I don't know, the two of them just, like, they want each other so bad until the other shows some sort of clear sign that they want them, and it's like Denna, at least in Quoth's perception, is like backs off a little bit as soon as he says something that might be perceived as like a legitimate, hey, like, I'm into you. So it's I don't know, it's so tough. I mean, it's a really, I think, honest and well-written portrayal of like young love. They're teenagers,
right? For whatever
it's
reason,
tough.
Quoth feels very reserved and doesn't want to be a guy that puts moves on Denna, and Denna's not just gonna be the one that comes out and to be so forward. So it's just like they're always kind of stuck in that weird space. So yeah.
It's tough. We get Fella debriefs everyone on this whole thing after that, and then I don't know if there's anything else you want to mention about the stuff we get back at school. Quoth gets better at naming.
Yep, he's got all his money problems figured out.
Yeah.
It's there's the new headmaster, or what do they call? It's not a headmaster. It's like the new leader. It starts with a C, I think.
Yeah, I
the
know
new
what you're talking
the
about.
new. Yeah, whatever.
It's something with a C, right?
Yeah, it's something with the C.
Whatever.
But it's the professor he's had the worst relationship with, like Hemmer or something. Hem.
Just Hem.
Heme. Yeah, so that happened, and that's kind of where like the story ends, with being like, yeah, and then he came and he gave me a huge tuition, but whatever situation I worked out with the guy, I get half of it. So I'm like rich now.
It's like half of it over 10 talents.
Which that was
so
an interesting deal he managed to work in. Oh, it's Chancellor, by the way.
Chancellor.
They're called Chancellors.
Yeah, so he works that in because, yeah, he basically can flub his entrance exam, and then he can
have the mayor.
The worse he does, yeah, like the more the mayor is going to pay the school, so it's like a good
arrangement
situation for both parties.
Yeah. So let's see. Does anything else happen in those moments? I don't think anything
that warrants mentioning, and I still want to get to our two of our discussion points.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just wrap it up to the end. We're back at the Waystone Inn. Quoth can't open the darn box, and
Bast is doing some sketchy stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. We get some good discussion between Bast and Chronicler, where they're talking about like, okay, well, the Cathay is gonna mess everything up, but there's some good journey over destination type talk where God, I thought I had it down somewhere, but I'm not finding it. But there's a great quote in there that it's like Chronicler says to Bast that's like, look, they can't like the Cathay can do all this messed up stuff, but the Cathay can't make fruit not taste good to you. Like the Cathay
I do
can't
remember that.
yeah, it's like it didn't stop you from making your Reshi laugh today. Those are some of the lines I remember from it. And it's like, if the Cathay could really make everything absolutely horrible and terrible, then like nothing would be good. So we can at least have these moments, and it's kind of about savoring that. Yeah, maybe the destination might suck, but we do have these moments.
Yeah, Chronicler kind of tucks Bast down, being like, yep. You spoke to the tree, and that's bad, but there's lots of good going on still in life that we can enjoy.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah, that was a great moment.
So then, if we're good, so Bast does some sketchy stuff where it looks like he was. Maybe he hired we don't know exactly why, but it seems like maybe he hired those soldiers, or made a deal with those soldiers because he thought maybe it would like bring out Quoth if they threatened him, but that backfired if that was the plan. And
it's not explicitly mentioned. He does get a cut of the money, and they do have a conversation, but it was kind of unclear to me what was actually happening. Like, should we be suspicious of Bast, or is Bast just trying to provoke Quoth to kind of awaken his fire or whatever? But it's not sure. But it was interesting way to end it.
I agree. Well, then...
and also Quoth had those keys also to try and open the box.
He tries to open it with all the keys. Doesn't really work.
So something's going on with those keys and this box and the box. There's still the door, which I imagine will be the Door of Stone, which is the next book in the archives. So there's a lot of interesting stuff about the story of Tarbalin the Great that kind of mirrors Quoth's journey. And I thought the fact that the Fae didn't know who Tarbalin was interesting. And Quoth has the Cloak of Shadows, which mirrors the Cloak of Many Colors. So there was a lot of interesting parallels there, but I don't really have much more to say on it than that. It's like, is Quoth Tarbalin? Who knows? Like, is there some sort of way that would be possible? Not really.
Time travel?
Yeah,
stuff?
Not really, but
it's interesting.
He does mirror that legend so much, and there's no proof that Tarbalin actually existed so far. So I just thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
That's another part of in the Fae.
Before.
There's a very unique moment where he's with the Fae where she there's only certain parts of the Tarbalin story that she comments on, and the other parts she had never heard of before. One of them being that she didn't know Tarbalin never existed. And that was a huge moment for me. I was like, whoa, what's going on here? And then he's got the cloak of the shade, which can block him from stuff. And the idea of he called the stone and jumped off the roof, and it's did Quoth technically jump off the roof with Aelin and stuff? So it's I don't know if it's just poetic justice that he's mirroring the story, or if there's more to it than that. I mean, we know Quoth's story ends in tragedy, so who knows? But
it's interesting.
They hit a lot of the same beats, and that could just be Quoth telling his own story, making it sound like it's similar to Tarbalin's also.
Sure.
So, where it's I just thought it would be fun to include moments that mirror Tarbalin's and skip over the other stuff. It's me and Aelin were locked in a room, and he called the Nameless Stone, and then I jumped off the roof. It's okay, that happened. It's now I have a cloak, a shade, which is everyone's what does the Cloak of Many Colors look like? And they were all talking about it right before he gets the shade. So those moments I thought were interesting, but again, nothing definitive came out of my thought experiment there. But I was something's going on there too. I don't know if it's just Quoth being a clever storyteller, putting Easter eggs in, or if it's actually telling of a reveal that will happen in the Door of Stone.
Well, Quoth also, it's interesting because the Taborlin stories influence Quoth in ways. So he's obsessed with pockets.
Yes.
Because Taborlin had a ton of pockets in his cloak.
It's what got him into magic in the first place also.
Yeah, and Taborlin's story is is the reason why so he has
He puts pockets in everything.
put all these pockets in his thing, and it'd be interesting then if there's some sort of weird. It feels a little too time travel-y for me for this to be how it ends up, but that if Quoth were somehow Tamerlane, then he's like in this loop of influencing his own story,
Right.
which is, I guess, there's someone smarter than me could put together some sort of like idea that's how it's a story about stories, and it's a story influencing its own story. But
that would be a whole nother layer to this craziness.
Yeah, for sure.
Which would be cool. I just thought he could also just be a fanboy who wants to sound like Tamerlane the Great too. Who knows?
And he's also asked if, when he tries to tell that boy in the village that he's Quoth, he's asked if he can show him the cloak of no particular color.
And he's like, no, you're confusing that with Tamerlane. Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. So I kept reading little moments like that too, but it didn't get me anywhere. So
there, Charles, it might just be parallels. There's something I want to talk about that's got parallels to a story.
Well, I'll let you pick the next topic. We gotta fly through these, unfortunately.
Okay. Something that we really wanted to touch on, Charles, and maybe this is appropriate after we meandered through.
Nice.
Yes, we meandered through the entire story of Wise Man's fear with our pretty lengthy discussion before we even got here. Is a lot of people think that Wise Man's fear meanders.
Yes.
And they think that there's a lack of plot development that they'll often say is disappointing. And you and I wanted to touch on that. And I, in typical fashion,
very strong
these books, which I never did with Mistborn, is I think about the topic, and I usually just try to think about it and say, like, I'll make some bullet points if I need to remember certain things I want to hit, or I'll just be like, okay, I know what I want to say on this. But in this, I ended up like writing angrily my thoughts.
I will say, we will probably get a chance to go into this more in review of reviews, because a lot of my things were like, oh, this book needs an editor, like it feels like a lot of different things that don't go anywhere. So yeah, why don't you just kind of lay it on us, and I'll kind of react to it here.
So the goal of TAC, as conveyed by Braden, is not to win. I
like where this is going.
But it's to play a beautiful game. And on this reread, more than anything else, I noted and appreciate that this is what Wise Man's Fear and the Kingkiller Chronicles in general is. It's a beautiful game. This concept is conveyed both in the text in terms of some of these more explicit quotes, but it's also conveyed by the text.
Preach.
And I mean that by it's shown by the text in regard to its self-awareness about not delivering you a straightforward story that follows the beats we're used to. And in lieu of that, we just play the beautiful game that is the Kingkiller Chronicles. And so this brings me to one of the stories I loved so much within this story about a story, which is the story about Jack seeking the moon. And I absolutely love this. So it concludes. So Jax isn't happy. He's this boy. He's just never even felt joy, right? Mm-hmm. And he's chasing the moon. He thinks if he could just catch the moon, then he could be happy. So he's trying to chase the moon, and finally he tricks and captures the moon. And the story concludes with he caught her and he keeps her still. But whether or not he is happy is only for him to know.
Woo.
So to those who lament that the plot doesn't move more quickly, to those that demand that Rothfuss get the book out sooner, to those that want this to be about a hero rising up and delivering vengeance upon the Chandrian, I understand where you're coming from. I do, but I want to challenge you to stop trying to win the Kingkiller Chronicles and instead content yourself with playing a beautiful game.
Woo, can I get an amen? Woo! Yes, brilliant. Very well said. Man, that parallel with the game TAC is All you had to do was say, like the game Tech, and I was like, 100% yes. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, yes, yes. Very well said, sir. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Because I said, is it long? Yes. Did I ever mind? No. One of Patrick's greatest skills. It's like, I'm happy just reading because the way he writes, the rhythm in which he writes, I enjoyed every piece of it. Even the stuff that I didn't like as much as others, I had the same level of enjoyment reading it. And that's just a testament to Patrick Rothfuss's skills as a writer.
Well said, Charles.
So that's the whole big draw of reading this book. It's a beautiful book.
It's a beautiful game.
Yeah, it's a beautiful game.
Yeah, the prose is beautiful. Enjoy it for the journey. And, I mean, I don't know, all these people who just want to capture it the way that we learn Jax isn't necessarily happy just because he catches the moon, especially if you go about it in a way that isn't proper.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this book just takes its time, and it says, hey, let's enjoy this. Let's savor this while we have it, because you know the destination already.
Exactly. Beautiful. And man, what a great testament to this book that you managed to achieve, Dylan. Is like, that's the whole point of reading this story.
Exactly. Well, I was upset. This was like the thing that kept flowing through my mind as I was reading. And when we got to tax stuff, I was like, this is it.
Yes.
So I was like, I think Mistborn, we would get through the books and we would be able to say, hey, like, this is the theme of this book. And I think Sanderson is not as subtle in the Mistborn books in what those are about as Rothfuss is. And I thought that Kingkiller, there's things it floats around and this kind of stuff. It's more nebulous, and that's true. But each read I've had, it's felt more about something else, at least to me. And this time it was about playing a beautiful game.
Very, very well said. And that's true. And that's what makes Rothfuss writing so unique and what makes these stories so good. It's just the pleasure that is reading the book. So,
exactly.
Man,
and Charles.
Yes.
If you do have more there, then I want to let you say
go for it.
I have some other stuff that's kind of along these lines to the other thing we wanted to revisit, which was the Denna and Quoth stuff.
All right.
And I know we're running a little long, but
it's a 1,200-page book. What do you want? 44 hours of audiobook.
Yeah. There you go, Charles.
What are we supposed to do?
My favorite is when you get defensive against fans that haven't actually said anything against us yet. All right. So, do you have more you wanted to say on
No. You masterfully covered it.
So, we wanted to say, apparently, some people that you were reading in reviews were saying that the Denna and quote stuff was annoying. And sappy.
Yes.
The kind of the phrasing that you would see. So
yes.
I don't want to rehash all my Denna thoughts, especially as we're running long.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want to, because they haven't changed very much. So I'll direct people to the tirade that I went on in the Name of the Wind episode.
Yes,
this,
that covers a lot of the ground.
Mm-hmm. I feel the same way about a lot of it. I'll say, if we're dealing with some people saying more like that the relationship is annoying and sappy, I mean, I'm kind of a sucker for these stories of young love, so they hit me right in the feels, Charles. And,
I feel that.
especially the ones like this that seem like they're going to end up in a tragic way. And I think that we've said it's honest in a lot of ways too, and I think the book and therefore Rothfuss puts itself and himself out there trying to talk about young love in a way that's uncynical and vulnerable. And whether that's a bug or a feature for you is a matter of perspective. It's a feature for me. And I think a lot of that might account for whether people perceive things like I do or if they perceive it as sappy or annoying. I mean, a teenager with a crush? I mean, this is what it feels like. And I think
Yeah.
he captures that. I'll also say, I want to bring it back to the Jack story, Tack and Denna, or wrap all of those together. So there's clear parallels between the Jack story, Tack and Denna, some of which are more subtext, some of which are more explicit. So Quoth even says at one point, so I did not try to win her and contented myself with playing a beautiful game, but there was always a part of me that hoped for more, and so there was a part of me that was always a fool. As for Jackson the Moon, not only is Quoth always seeking Denna, and often trying to capture or win her, or trying to resist the urge to do so. The moon's also frequently mentioned in reference to, and even by Denna, who says, makes note that there's no moon on the night in the mayor's garden, even though apparently there's a sliver of a moon. And she comments that she likes moonless nights best. But I'll say the point of this, right? I think Quoth is a lot like Jax, in terms of Jax chases after the moon and thinks if he could just get her, then he'd be happy. And Quoth is similar with how he chases after Denna, and he thinks, hey, if I could just almost like the sense of like capture her, and that's what people are always trying to do to Denna, then I'll be happy. And Quoth is very ambivalent. He's always like fighting his nature in terms of wanting to win Denna, and he can never really let that go, but knowing that it's not right, and that like he just needs to enjoy his time spent with her. And I think that's wonderfully explored. Some people think Denna literally is the moon, for the record. Like, I think that's a little much. I think it's more of a parallel, kind of what you were talking about around Taberlin. Like, Denna is like the moon in terms of how Jax chases the moon and Quoth chases Denna.
Right, it's a theme in the book.
Yeah.
No, it's very well said. I can't say it much better than that. It is very much about enjoying the process, and I think we said it in our last episode when we did the bulk of the discussion of Quoth and Denna. It's like, look, anyone that's been in a similar situation gets hit right in the feels with this with this story. So that enough should be a testament to the story. I will also say, for all those people that are frustrated, let's pick up on the cues that we're given. It's like Patrick Rothfuss knows that it's frustrating, and it sneaks its way into the story, where in ways where you should be thinking like, is it maybe frustrating on purpose? Because there's this the moment in the beginning where he's at the school and he knows Ambrose has done his ring, and he almost gets himself killed trying to get it, almost gets his friends in trouble for trying to get it. He runs into all kinds of trouble because now Ambrose has his blood and is committing malfeasance against him just for this ring. And there's this whole moment where Will, they barely escape with their lives. And Will is like, you realize you've gone way over the hill concerning this Denna girl, don't you? Like, that's how the chapter ends, where they're like licking their wounds and he's like, can we finally have enough of this? Like, no one else understands what he sees in her. His friends, Will is over it. Was over it in the last book. Will's like, she's not that good looking. She's this and that and the other thing. It is interesting that Bast has seen her and knows what she looks like. It's like, yeah, her nose is small or whatever. So it's like, Rothfuss knows this and gives you crooked and gives you these moments of like, can we please be done? Like, you realize you're going too far with this. So it's like, he hears you and he's acknowledging that, but that's like, there's more going on here from Quoth's perspective that Quoth can't shake, and he's not just going to suddenly shake it because it's exhausting to read about. There's also a great moment where he's with the crew and like this when they're fighting the bandits, and it's two of the members of his crew are like in this will they won't they relationship.
Yeah.
And Quoth is getting incredibly frustrated by it. And he's talking to Tempe. He's like, why doesn't anyone just tell them that they like each other and that they should get together? And Tempe has this great quote where it's like, trying to help right now would be like trying to put out fire with my hands, painful and with no real results. So it's like, just let it like burn out. Quoth can't even see it in himself. He has that, like, we know from when everyone was trying to tell him to take a vacation, to take a sabbatical. It's like, Quoth, you have to realize other people's perspectives here. It's like, no one wants you here. You're too much controversy. It's like, hey, like your relationship with Denna is very distracting and benefits no one and is constantly putting you out. It's like, what is the deal? And he can't even recognize that in other relationships. So how much more do you have to read before you kind of change your opinion of this relationship? It's like, very clearly this is something going on in Quoth's perspective that he can't shake. And just because it's frustrating doesn't mean it's bad. It's true to Quoth's character. And that's what makes it super good. And that's why our opinions haven't changed.
Well, we like it. The pacifist in me wants to appease people by saying, if it's not for you and you don't like it, even if you acknowledge, hey, it's frustrating, I just don't like the feeling of being frustrated by this as I'm reading it, that's fine. It's okay.
Definitely.
You're allowed to feel that way, but Charles and I enjoy it, and lots of people enjoy how.
And Patrick has heard you, and it's in the writing, and it's acknowledged.
Yeah,
so
that too. Charles, I was thinking that the Will quote in some of these conversations that could have been taken right out of some conversations you, me, and Derek have had with me in the place of quotes. So, this hits
definitely. It's like. What's the issue here? It's very cut and dry that like it's time to move on, but it's not that simple when it's you that it's happening to. So
yes,
it's a beautiful moment
exactly.
captured in the Quoth-Denna relationship.
It's so, dude. I don't know if there's another romantic relationship in maybe fiction in general, fantasy in particular. That hits me as hard in the feels as this one does. And I mean, credit to Rothfuss. I mean, people have strong emotional reactions to this, and
either positive or negative, they're strong.
Positive or negative,
as Rothfuss has said himself. Something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So no, it is a really poignant one and really unique one to like just the fantasy genre also. Because, like, you know, so many stories have a more transparent love story arc, kind of, and sometimes they subvert it. But in this case, where it's just frustrating and it's like, it's a unique play. But it's like you said, it's just a beautiful game, you know? It's just what's happening and how it's happened. And Rothfuss does it in such a way that it's just a joy to read, for me anyway. I love it. It's hard to say goodbye to this world. It's hard to not be able to read the third and final book. It's hard not to get those conclusions. But like we said, it's all in the process. It's all in making the game. So we're in no ways trying to rush Patrick, which is take your time, man. Make a beautiful game, and we'll read it. So,
well said, Charles. It is hard to say goodbye.
There's still more. We still have a review of reviews. We haven't quite let go of this story yet.
True, and we'll create an episode at some point of Slow Regard.
Slow Regard will come, and we'll have the review of reviews to hold out and kind of get more into these last few plot points we may have had to have gone over real quickly. We get the chance to revisit and review of reviews. So now more than ever, I would encourage people to listen to that. There's a lot we only got to glance over in this, but I mean, with something as epic as this book, I'm impressed with what we were able to achieve. So a proper send-off, I hope, worthy of the Kingkiller Chronicles. So this has been a pleasure. One day we'll reconvene for book 3, The Door of Stone. And what a day that will be. And until we reach that moment, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to play the outro for everybody. Thank you all so much for listening. Please check out Review of Reviews for this book. I mean, what piece of fiction was made more appropriately for Review of Reviews than the Kingkiller Chronicles? The reviews are all over the place in this story. We're going to get into it, but man, 1 stars, 5 stars, all over the place. We're going to set it straight on Wednesday. And then we have a very exciting 2-parter of French pitching fantasy. We're kind of experimenting with the form of it, so you don't want to miss that. We're going to figure out what we're going to read after Lord of the Rings. It's finally happening. Just as I've now finally read Kingkiller Chronicles, Marshall finally have read the one series to rule them all, Lord of the Rings. So that will be very exciting. So many beautiful things to look forward to in the near future on the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. Thank you for listening, everybody, and go forth and conquer, friends.